Welcome. Today is May 24th, 2022, and you're listening to the Caravan Podcast, a venture of the Herbert and Jane Dwight Working Group on the Middle East and the Islamic World at the Hoover Institution. The Working Group publishes research and commentary on the Middle East with questions for U.S. policy, and you can find our work at www.hoover.org/caravan. I'm Cole Bunzel, a fellow at the Hoover Institution and member of the Working Group, and today I'm very pleased to be joined and in studio, no less, by my colleague Joel Rayburn, who is a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and a fellow at the New America Foundation as well. Joel is a former diplomat and Army officer. His recent posts include, among other things, Senior Director for Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon at the National Security Council, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Levant Affairs at the State Department, and from July 2018 to January 2021, U.S. Special Envoy for Syria. Joel, thanks very much for doing this podcast with me today.
Very glad to be with you.
And in person, which is a first for this podcast.
Oh, really?
And hopefully the first, but not the last. So, Joel, I'd like to touch on a range of issues pertaining to U.S. policy in the Middle East and your expertise, including the ongoing negotiations for a revived nuclear deal with Iran, where those are going, and the Biden administration's apparent climb down from its tough rhetoric on Saudi Arabia. But I thought we'd start with a subject that is near and dear to your heart as well as your mind, and that is, of course, the matter of Syria and what is happening there today. So you have a new essay out with Hoover, co-authored with Nawaf Obaid, which is titled Trouble for Putin's Arab Client, Bashar al-Assad's Inevitable Reckoning. And in the piece you write that, and I quote here, the Western allies have a new opportunity, end quote, when it comes to Syria policy. And the opportunity, you say, is afforded by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I wanted to ask, first of all, what is it that you're proposing here? What is the opportunity and for the West with regard to Syria?
On this issue, what Nawaf and I wanted to highlight was that there's been a slow developing set of investigations and prosecutions in Europe in particular of members of the Assad regime for atrocities, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, and so on. And a lot of those cases are starting to come to fruition more than 10 years into the conflict. So it's taken a long time to develop. But there were two cases in Germany that we highlighted, one that already resulted in a conviction and another one which is ongoing, and the case is very strong against the defendant, who was a medical doctor who, in a sort of Joseph Mengele type of way, assisted with the torture of prisoners in an Assad detention center. But these are, what we wanted to highlight is that these are kind of the tip of the iceberg. And you're going to see coming in Germany and France, in a place like the Netherlands, national prosecutions, so prosecutions of French and German nationals, prosecutions of perpetrators who committed crimes against French and German nationals.
I see.
But you're also going to see, I think, some assertions of universal jurisdiction from some of the courts that assert universal jurisdiction on things like crimes against humanity. Mm-hmm. And these are going to really obstruct the inclination of some countries, some actors, to push for normalization of relations with the Assad regime, which the Russians have been trying to promote for some years now. It's going to make it very difficult. It's going to impose a political cost on proposals like that, and it could create a material risk for businesses or countries that are thinking about normalizing not just political relations but economic relations with Damascus. Because if you start to get judgments, if you start to get criminal convictions, you're likely also to get civil judgments associated with the same evidence against the Assad regime, and then you could very well have courts that would that could rule, and certainly I think there would be lawsuits to try to make this happen, where courts might say that businesses, non-Syrian businesses or governments that are going to do contracts or investments in Damascus, that some of their assets would be vulnerable to civil judgments
Mhm.
against the Assad regime. In the same way, for example, that there have been cases in some courts against banks that had depositors who were facilitating terrorist activities, like by Hezbollah and or Hamas and so on. So, I think what you'll see a greater chilling effect against those who would pursue normalization policies. So there's a bit of a train wreck coming between this accountability
Mhm.
vector, if you will, of prosecutions against the Assad regime and members associated with the Assad regime, with the vector of normalization policies. They're going to collide, and I don't think you're going to see an easy time for normalization. So, the larger argument that Nawaf and I were making is this is something that the Western countries should embrace, especially as they're looking, as the United States and the European allies are looking for ways to raise costs for Vladimir Putin's foreign policy.
Right.
This is an area where you could do it. You could make it impossible for Russia to continue to push for the normalization of Assad. You could impose greater costs for association with Assad, and now would be a good time to do that.
So when we see Bashar al-Assad, I believe in March he visited the UAE. He met with Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the United Arab Emirates.
Right.
And so is that coming from Russian pressure, or is that a policy independently pursued by the UAE and perhaps sympathized with by other regional actors?
Well, the UAE's inclination toward at least a pathway to normalization with the Assad government is not new. It's been something the UAE has been talking about for at least 4 years, and that they activated in late 2018 when they reopened their embassy in Damascus, sort of, against our advice in the Trump administration. Their explanation of it throughout has been that the Emirates see a lot of Iranian influence in Damascus, a lot of Russian influence in Damascus, but very little influence on the part of the Arab states in Damascus. And so what they're proposing is that maybe it's time for the Arab countries to return to Damascus so that they can compete for influence with the Assad regime to try to crowd out Iranian influence. I've always thought that was a far-fetched idea. I'm skeptical, to say the least. And I also thought that there was an unspoken rationale for this Emirati policy, which is that in reality, the Emirates have been more concerned about the influence of Turkey and President Erdogan in Syria, and that they were willing to entertain the idea that the Assad regime, if it were stabilized, could be something of a buffer against Turkish influence in Syria.
Okay, so things get complicated fast when it comes to understanding what's going on with the UAE
Yes.
and Syria. So we know where you and Nawaf stand when it comes to the potential for normalization with Syria. I certainly know the way that some on we might call it the foreign policy left, how they feel about this. They would probably argue that the Assad regime has, for all intents and purposes, won the conflict to the extent that it controls about, 2/3 of the country, something like that?
No, I mean, people throw these figures around,
Yeah.
but it's. I think it's better to think of what percentage of Syria's pre-war population, what portion of Syria's pre-war population lives under Bashar al-Assad's rule now.
It hasn't been eliminated.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's less. It's under 10 million people out of a pre-war population of 23 million. So Bashar al-Assad rules over a small minority of Syria's pre-war population. The military victory, if you can call it that, by the Assad regime and the Russians and the Iranians in Aleppo in 2016 was a Pyrrhic victory because it cost them so much. There's really nothing left in the cupboard for the Assad regime in terms of military manpower. So they're caught in a war that they can't close, and they'll never be able to close it. So Assad really has no military path out of this conflict. He hasn't won anything.
So it's a frozen conflict, essentially.
It's a frozen conflict, but although that's a little bit of a mislabel, because if you drill down to local areas, I mean the country is extremely volatile. Even in territories that the Assad regime supposedly reconquered, the control there is very thin, tenuous, and it feels as though they're just kind of hours away from a reignition of the war in those places. Daraa in the south is case in point, which it's just sort of the Assad regime is kind of sitting on a volcano there, as they always have been, and the situation's no better.
So I tried to do my best to kind of outline the perhaps progressive critique of the Trump administration's approach to the Syria problem, and what I might say is your approach to the Syria problem. But what about the Biden administration? Does it have a kind of an understandable Syria policy, or is it kind of is it a collection of different things?
Well, the Biden administration has the same policy goals, same nominal policy goals, but they don't really have a comprehensive strategy for achieving those goals. And what they do have is activities and plans to deal with some of the symptoms of the Syrian conflict, as opposed to resolving its causes, the drivers of the conflict. So the Biden administration is prioritizing humanitarian assistance, but without dealing with the cause of the humanitarian crisis, which is the Assad regime's continuing war against this, a big swath of the Syrian people, and dealing with counterterrorism, prosecuting a counterterrorism campaign, without addressing the political driver of the terrorism in Syria, which is the conflict between Assad and large swaths of Syrian society. So I think we're in a period right now where no one really has a strategy for bringing the war to a close, including Assad himself, including the Russians. And that means that the risk of an escalation, the risk of an outbreak of a broader conflict is there really every hour of the day.
Yeah, so you mentioned the issue of humanitarian assistance. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and you were explaining this to me in much detail yesterday when we were talking, is this issue of the Bab al-Hawa humanitarian corridor. It's a border crossing in northern Syria between Turkey and Syria, and it's maintained with a UN mandate with the approval of the UN Security Council, and that mandate expires, I believe, in early July. And Russia, as I was reading today, one of its spokesmen says that they're threatening to veto this mandate. Then essentially you would have a suspension of UN aid from Turkey into Syria that helps some 3 million people survive. So what is Russia doing here? What is the story of this humanitarian corridor?
Well, what Russia has been trying to do over the past several years, and they've used the limited term of this mandate. The fact that the mandate comes up for debate every 6 months or 12 months at the most means every 6 or 12 months the Russians try to water down, weaken, reduce the scope of the cross-border assistance that the UN is providing in order to create a deference to the sovereignty of Assad's government, and to try to pressure the UN to run humanitarian assistance basically through Assad, so that humanitarian assistance will go to Damascus and be coordinated with Assad's regime to then go out to places beyond the Assad regime's control. So cross-line assistance is what they call it. And of course, a large chunk of that. I mean, there has been a sizable amount of UN assistance that's been going through the Assad regime, and the Assad regime directs it to their loyalists, and they skim off the top of it, and they
Right.
resell it, and then it's essentially a portion of it amounts to a subsidy of the Assad regime. So the Russians and Assad would like to see more and more of the UN assistance running essentially through Assad himself, so that he can skim and use it as a subsidy. And eventually, they would like to, if they can do it without incurring a big political cost, to just shut down the cross-border assistance altogether, and have any assistance that the UN or the humanitarian aid community wants to do have to go through Assad himself. So they've been approaching that by degrees. There used to be a lot more border crossings that the UN was authorized to work across, including from Jordan into Syria. The Russians have deleted those one by one, and we're down to just the one, Bab al-Hawa. The Russian, and in the bigger context, bigger strategic context, for the Russians, this is leverage that they can wield against the same powers that are opposing their invasion of Ukraine. So they'll try to get some mileage and leverage out of it. I would be surprised if the Russians allow this to roll over with no changes. I would be surprised if they allow it to roll over without demanding some sort of huge price for letting it be renewed.
So if it isn't renewed, if we don't, meet the demands of what Russia, whatever they may be, for continuing this mandate in July, what would the repercussions be in practice?
Well,
does that mean people leaving, going into Turkey and to Europe? I mean, that's one of the threats.
You could,
right?
yeah, you could have that. The people who are dependent on this aid, yeah, you could have a disruption of deliveries, especially to some of these internally displaced person camps where the conditions are absolutely horrible. They're really severe conditions. You could have people who have no choice but to try to go somewhere else, cross the border into Turkey, and so on. This is why, for a long time, I personally thought and argued for coming up with a viable Plan B. So if in an instant the UN suddenly lost its mandate to do cross-border assistance, what could be put in its place? I thought a consortium of national aid among the Turks, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, and other donors should be organized and the infrastructure prepared so that this consortium could fill the gap immediately if the UN had to stop. But those preparations, as far as I know, have not matured to the degree that they would need to rush in and fill the gap if there's a disruption after early July.
So when you see the UN ambassador, the U.S.'s ambassador to the UN, talking up the importance of this border crossing and how Russia really has to agree to a continuance, what's your view?
I'm really glad for the U.S. ambassador to the UN's attention to the problem. That's the first thing I'd say, and I think it's really to Ambassador Greenfield's credit. But I would not advise that negotiating strategy with the Russians, which is, in other words, is to say, and we've been through one round of this already with the Biden administration, which is to say, ahead of the debate, to say, this is a vital thing. It's vital to our interests and international interests for this cross-border assistance to continue, through the UN to continue, and there's no alternative. All you've done there is you have now allowed the Russians to raise their price significantly for selling their acquiescence. You want to buy their acquiescence to the UN, to roll over the UN mandate. Now you don't do that by saying this is really important and there's no alternative to it. It's really you're basically saying you're willing to pay a lot, as opposed to coming up with an
alternative.
Yeah, a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, in negotiation doctrine. So I think there should have been a BATNA last year. There should have been a BATNA during the Trump administration, and there should be a BATNA now. You'd be more likely, I suspect, you'd be more likely for the Russians to let the mandate be renewed if you had a viable alternative that meant that if the Russians vetoed, they would then pay the political price for it with Turkey, with the international community, but they wouldn't get any material change. The assistance would still go. And in fact, the Russians would lose their leverage for arguing for more aid to go through Damascus. So if I were advising the U.S. negotiators and the European negotiators, I would advise a different negotiation approach.
Speaking of negotiations, I want to move on to the issue of Iran, from Syria to one of Syria's enablers. As many of those listening will be well aware, the Biden administration has been adamant about returning to the JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, better known as the Iran nuclear deal, which the Obama administration negotiated in 2015 and the Trump administration withdrew from in 2018. Re-entry into the JCPOA was for the Biden administration a key plank of its Middle East policy, but it hasn't been so easy getting back into it. So I guess my first question for you here, before we get into the merits and demerits and the details, if we want to go there, of this potentially revived nuclear deal, is why has it been so hard for the Biden administration to get there? Why would Iran drag its feet if this deal is such a good deal for both parties?
Well, the Biden administration,
in theory.
Yeah, right. Well, the Biden administration has not been tightly enforcing the U.S. sanctions against Iran's oil transactions. The Iranian regime has been able to sell, according to some reports, upwards of 1 million barrels a day in orders to China and some other places without the recipients being sanctioned, without the sanctions being enforced. And so there's already been a de facto lifting of the sanctions pressure. So if the Iranians are now generating oil revenues without a deal, then their interest in entering into a deal is much less. They're much more comfortable. They were never going to enter into a deal on U.S. terms unless they were under a lot of pressure, made to feel really uncomfortable, which was the point of the Trump administration reimposing those sanctions in the first place, was to get the Iranians to a different deal on U.S. terms. So it was a mistake, I think. It was an error by the Biden administration to...
So why did our brilliant negotiators cease enforcing these sanctions?
I suspect that I suspect that it was meant to be a gesture of goodwill. I suspect that there was a de facto understanding that if the Iranians came back to the table, as long as the Iranians were at the table negotiating,
in the other room,
wherever they were, wherever the table was, as long as they were at the table negotiating for a renewal, a re-entry into this deal, that the sanctions would not be enforced, at least not tightly. And so again, as I said, to relieve the pressure and then expect the Iranians to do what the United States wants them to do, I think is wrong-headed.
Right, yeah, so one reason would be for the Iranians dragging their feet is that the pressure has already been relieved.
They're already getting what they need.
Right.
They're already selling hundreds of thousands or 1 million barrels of oil a day. Why do they need to go back into a deal? I mean, how much more would they get? They would get their cash unfrozen. I've seen some estimates. It's around $90 billion. Who knows for sure? That would be liquid if it were unfrozen. They get that, but in terms of the oil revenues, they're already selling upwards of 1 million barrels a day, so they can. It's not like they're feeling as much pain as they were during the latter months of the Trump administration. Their oil exports were crunched down to under 400,000 barrels a day, and at one point under 300,000 barrels a day. They were in a crisis. I don't think they're feeling that pressure now.
So we let them out of the crisis, and we're negotiating a new JCPOA. It seems that the administration hasn't quite acknowledged that this is not going to be the same JCPOA that the 2015 one was, where we were supposed to have a quote-unquote 1-year breakout time. That is a breakout time for a new building a nuclear weapon. Some of the details that I've seen coming out about the new deal, should it ever be re-entered, are quite generous to the Iranians, to put it gently. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those?
Well, I think there are a couple of one of the fatal flaws, and there are at least two, and I think a third. The fatal flaws in the original JCPOA. One of them is that it expires. The second one is that the Iranians were allowed to continue to enrich, albeit at a lower level, as opposed to having to surrender their enrichment capability and then agree not to enrich. The third one has to do with their regional activities, but more on that later. So if the administration is just going to go back into the terms of the 2015 deal, well, some of those provisions have already expired. So it's a weaker deal. For example, the UN arms embargo has already expired.
And ballistic missile technology imports will expire in another year or so, something like that.
Yeah, so we're right up against deadlines in the original deal. And the Iranians still would enjoy. They would retain the ability to enrich uranium. So you're sort of back in the same problem.
One thing I've seen is that the advanced centrifuges that the Iranians have been building and using since the Trump administration left the deal would be allowed to remain in the country in, quote, storage, which would seem to mean that the breakout time is vastly diminished, since they could simply roll this advanced centrifuges out of storage if the deal, when those provisions expire.
Yeah, there's some reports that is what's on the table, is that the Iranians would just sort of hold the advanced centrifuges. I mean, they wouldn't have to surrender them. And then, yes, if there was a future U.S. administration that wanted to leave the deal, terminate the deal, that the Iranians would then just have the ability to break the seals on wherever the advanced centrifuge is stored and fire up the enrichment, the accelerated enrichment. So in other words, it would be sort of a sword of Damocles hanging over a future U.S. president who might want to exit the deal.
Right. And so one thing, and I'm getting back to this issue of why the Iranians are dragging their feet. I have a hard time understanding or predicting, rather, what it is the Iranians are angling for here. Do you think that there will be a JCPOA, but the Iranians are just kind of trying to wring every last possible concession out of us along the way? Or are they just is this all kind of a play act for the U.S. to relieve all the pressure while they negotiate, but it's all theater?
It's hard to know without being in those negotiations. My impression of the Biden administration is that they remain very eager to try to get a deal of some kind, and that they have been willing so far to make some concessions that you wouldn't expect. And they may be inclined to make some concessions that you wouldn't advise them to, just in order to re-enter the deal. However, from the Iranian end of it, my own view has never been that for the Iranians this was first and foremost about the nuclear capability. This instead was about having the leverage that would enable them to continue their aggression against the region around them and to try to consolidate hegemony in the Gulf region, in the northern Middle East, against the Arab countries with impunity. So to the extent that the U.S. and European countries are willing to expend all their leverage over the Iranian regime just for the nuclear issue, which is, I mean, it's an important issue, sure, but just for the nuclear issue, but excluding the Iranians' military expeditions into the Arab world in particular, then the nuclear file becomes a bit of a red herring. And you can wind up with an Iranian regime that is allowed to sell oil in an unlimited way, allowed to buy and sell weapons in an unlimited way, develop missiles, while it's waging war against U.S. allies in the Middle East.
And all they have to do for the U.S. international community to ignore all of this aggression is to adhere to some watered-down nuclear agreement.
This was the
gradually
problem.
Expires.
Yeah, this was the problem with the JCPOA in the first place, and this is why President Trump exited the deal. There's a lot of, I mean, there's been a lot of rhetoric that, asserting that President Trump was determined to exit the Iran deal because it was President Obama's deal, or part of President Obama's diplomatic legacy. But I mean, my own experience inside the Trump administration was the thing that really compelled President Trump to leave the deal. What was the Iranian military expansion into Yemen, into the Gulf region, into the northern Middle East. And when President Trump asked for non-military options for countering this Iranian military aggression, he was told, well, you don't have any economic pressure tools because we've voluntarily given those up as part of the Iran deal. And as Qasem Soleimani was waging war against us and our allies in several countries, and the Iranian regime was firing off ballistic missiles at our allies, with the Europeans warning us not to sanction the Iranian regime, like the central bank and the national oil company and so on. In response to that, it became intolerable for President Trump, and that was the last straw, after which he decided to exit the deal.
That's interesting. So he realized, and the people around him realized, that the nuclear issue can't really be separated from the regional adventurism issue, because economic sanctions are off the table once you have the JCPOA.
Yeah, if you recall that in 2017, we in the Trump administration, the president started using, and Secretary Tillerson started using the language that, well, the Iranians may or may not be in compliance with the letter of the JCPOA, but they're in violation of the spirit of the JCPOA.
It had a spirit?
Well, I mean,
the spirit was one of amity and trust, and no.
I think every deal has a spirit, and for the Iranians to be firing off cruise missiles and ballistic missiles at Riyadh and the UAE.
And arresting American citizens.
And Qasem Soleimani sort of flinging his troops against ours in Syria, and then rocketing our diplomatic presence in Iraq and so on. That came to be intolerable at the same time that we weren't sanctioning the Iranian central revenues. It got too much to. It was an incoherent approach. If you look at the options that were presented to President Trump were, well, you can do nothing and just absorb this punishment from the Iranian regime and leave your allies to fend for themselves, or you can have a military response. Well, what about the soft power responses? What about the non-military responses in the middle of that spectrum? No, sir, you're not allowed to use those because of the JCPOA. Your most powerful non-war tools are behind JCPOA glass. You can't touch them. Really, I mean, that was so those tools were taken out of the quiver, and it was just unsustainable. That's exactly what will happen again if the Biden administration re-enters a deal. The Iranian regime, because it's Supreme Leader Khamenei's national security policy to attack the region around him, to create a threat all the time against the region around him, the Iranian regime is going to continue to do that, and then the Biden administration and the Europeans are going to find themselves in the same boat. Then they're going to have to. Then they're going to. Someone's going to say, "Well, let's sanction them." Are we going to go to war with them? No, not as the first. Not as the first response. Okay, well, let's sanction them, and then someone will say, "Well, we can't, because they're unsanctionable. They're on base. They're untouchable because of the JCPOA, and it won't be sustainable. The JCPOA will collapse of its own weight at that point."
So one of the things that we heard Biden administration officials saying at the beginning of the administration, including then Secretary, or not quite yet, Secretary of State Antony Blinken during his Senate confirmation process, was that the JCPOA was going to be used as a, quote, platform for a longer and stronger deal that would also include the host of regional issues. Regional issues has always struck me as a euphemism. I mean, we're talking about killing Americans, things like this. What do you make of this idea? One thing I've noticed about longer and stronger is you don't hear it anymore. It's gone.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the Biden administration and the Europeans are in a position now where all the leverage that they hold over the Iranian regime, they will expend to get back to a mutual return to the JCPOA. And there will be no leverage left over to try to compel the Iranian regime to then agree to stop waging war or to stop prosecuting Supreme Leader Khamenei's policy of attacking the rest of the region. All you'll be left with at that point is more Iranian regime extortion. Then the only leverage that the United States and the Europeans will have is to say, well, how much more can we pay you to please stop attacking our regional allies and threatening the existence of our Middle Eastern allies? And I think that'll be an uncomfortable position to be in.
How much wealthier can we make you?
How much more can we give you to try to purchase your ceasefire?
Well, that probably makes our allies very uncomfortable, and that segues us into the next topic that I wanted to touch on here, and that is the issue of Saudi Arabia. So the Biden administration coming into office, it seemed to me like they had kind of two major planks of their foreign policy as relates to the Middle East. One, and these are actually set out in the Democratic Party platform of 2000. One was to re-enter the nuclear deal, and the other was to kind of isolate and shame Saudi Arabia, and particularly the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who goes by the initials MBS in policy wonk circles. And the justification for putting distance between the U.S. and the Saudis, I think part of it had to do with the Trump administration being very cozy with the Saudis, but it also, of course, had to do with the fact that MBS was implicated in the murder of a Turkish journalist and activist, Jamal Khashoggi, in October 2018 in Istanbul. The U.S. the U.S. intelligence community assigned responsibility to the Saudi Crown Prince for that killing, and so the Biden administration was intent on punishing MBS. There was all this talk about, quote-unquote, recalibrating the relationship. But recently, I've noticed that the Biden administration seems to be walking a lot of this back. And the most recent reports I've seen say that President Biden is actually planning to have a meeting with MBS. So what do you make of, possibly the next month, so what do you make of this kind of this walk back or this climb down? Is that the right way to look at it?
Well, I think what's happened is that the Biden administration has had to confront the reality that Saudi Arabia is too big a state. It's too big a player. It's too big an ally. I mean, not in the formal sense, but it's too big a partner and too important a partner of the United States for the United States to allow to just walk away from the relationship. It's also a very institutionalized relationship. It's been many decades now. The U.S. government is and the Saudi government are institutionally plugged in with one another in a very deep way. The Saudi, the Saudi, let's say, administrative class is very much they're American educated. There are more than 300,000 Saudis who were born in the United States. They're essentially children of Saudis that were in the United States as students. And the United States is the only country for which the Saudi government allows its own citizens to hold dual citizenship. And somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 Saudis. I mean, so there's a really deep U.S.-Saudi relationship that goes beyond a single person, or it goes beyond personality conflicts between the leaders of the day. It's an institutional relationship that comes from shared interests. Maybe to some extent, more and more, actually, these days, maybe a little bit shared values, but certainly shared interests. And it would be reckless for U.S. interests just to walk away from that, or to downgrade it. And I think also, a great power that needs allies, that works through allies, that has allies. I think you warn your enemies in public and you admonish your allies in private.
Exactly.
It really has to be the statesmanship principle that you follow. And I think in the last couple of decades, sometimes in the United States, we get that backwards. And it's to our detriment. So I think here, with the Saudi situation, we're coming to, there's a more pragmatic approach that's emerging from Washington.
And I think that's, in my opinion and your opinion, a good thing.
Yeah.
And Biden probably will meet with MBS.
And again, I am not saying that the United States should have a valueless foreign policy. I mean, that's not who the United States is or has ever been. And if you have a valueless foreign policy, then why be the United States? You may as well be Ceausescu's Romania. So I'm not saying that the United States, part of the United States promoting its interests is promoting its values around the world. But we also have geopolitical facts, and we do have enemies and adversaries in the world. In this world that we have to confront, and we should not turn away willing allies who are invested in lining up with us against our shared adversaries.
And Saudis and the UAE and other of our Gulf allies, of course, their main concern is Iran and Iranian expansionism. Do you think that the Biden administration is coming around to kind of that view, or are they still intent on kind of erecting what I think President Obama once called a kind of realignment, where there would be a kind of equipoise between the Saudis and the Iranians?
It looks to me like there's still a little bit too much hangover of that very unfortunate view of the Middle East by President Obama. I mean, he famously described to Jeffrey Goldberg that the Saudis and the Israelis just sort of needed to learn to share the region.
Saudis and the Iranians, yeah.
No, that the Saudis and the Israelis needed to learn to share the region with the Iranian regime.
Right.
Which, from the perspective of Riyadh and the Israelis, sounds a bit nonsensical. And I've had associates in those countries who've described that as being told that like a potential murder victim is being told that you have to work things out with your would-be murderer. So there's still a little too much of that, I think, in not just in the Biden administration, but in U.S. foreign policy circles, in Congress as well. And it's not realistic in this kind of world that we live in.
How much of the kind of intended rapprochement with the Saudis, do you think has to do with the war in Ukraine and the rise in the spike in oil prices? And we've seen reports about the U.S. officials calling up and trying to ask the Saudis to increase oil output, which is of course difficult for them in the first place because they have an institutional arrangement with what is called OPEC plus, so they can't just break that unless they want to alienate their allies in OPEC plus. But what do you make of the oil issue and the Ukraine angle?
Well, I think you're right. Certainly, the United States and the EU found themselves suddenly needing to have alternatives to Russian energy, and then suddenly, Saudi Arabia, its importance emerges again. It comes to the forefront again. So I think. My understanding of the Saudi perspective, though, is that the entreaties from the United States and from Europeans to increase oil production, that the Saudis wanted to see that request made part of a broader energy strategy, and that would take into account market factors like. With the futures market for oil, which is based on, to a great degree, on spare capacity in the out years, and the spare capacity in the out years overwhelmingly is in Saudi Arabia. So if the Saudis begin to use the spare capacity now, what will that do to the futures market? What will that do to the price of oil deliveries in the future? It could create an inadvertent spike. So that I think there's some technical explanations there. I don't think there's been a sort of a simplistic narrative saying, well, there's personality conflict between Saudi leadership and U.S. leadership, and therefore the Saudi leadership decided to rebuff the U.S. request, sort of an act of petulance. I don't think that's how these things happen. I don't think that's how this particular situation played out. I think it's much more about having a comprehensive approach to the energy markets. I don't think it can be reduced to a personality conflict.
And that's an interesting perspective we don't hear very much about. Last question for you, Joel, and this just has to do with the kind of the nature of the U.S. Saudi relationship. We're often told that we're at a low point in the history of this relationship, and I know you were recently in Saudi Arabia meeting with some Saudi officials. So back in March, Karen Elliott House wrote this in the Wall Street Journal, quote, "In the 40 years I have been visiting this country, Saudi Arabia, never has anger at the U.S. been so visceral or so widespread," end quote. I'm curious to see how that observation kind of fits in with your own recent experience. Do you think that you're kind of emphasizing institutional relationships that are deep, years in the making? Do you think that's overstatement?
Well, not really, because I think sure, there's deep frustration amongst the Saudis with the United States, but there's also an acknowledgement on the Saudi side about, but we're stuck with each other. Yes, Washington's very frustrated with Saudi Arabia right now. Saudi Arabia is very frustrated with Washington right now, but we're stuck with each other. So since we're stuck with each other, why don't we start talking about how to resolve our frustrations as opposed to a divorce, so to speak. And I think there's broad acknowledgement, at least this is my experience. There's broad acknowledgement amongst Saudis that the idea that the Saudis are going to trade their strategic relationship with the United States for a strategic relationship with China just is a non-starter. There's just no chance of that. The institutional relationships are too strong, and the Chinese can't do for Saudi Arabia what the United States does, has done, will do. The United States is irreplaceable to the Saudis, and my own opinion is the Saudis are irreplaceable to the United States.
So 40-year low point, I mean...
It may be, well, that may be. However, these things wax and wane. And as long as we are indispensable to one another, then I have every hope that the ship will right itself.
Well, on that cheerful note, Joel Rayburn, thank you for this conversation, for coming on the Caravan Podcast. You can find Joel on Twitter at Joel_Rayburn. Please subscribe to the podcast and stay tuned for the next episode and discussion.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.